Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about the false dilemma fallacy, also known as the either or the black and white fallacy. Basically, this involves setting up a situation as though there are only two possible choices, when in reality, there may be many, many more. This is basically a way of oversimplifying or misrepresenting a situation. Often in order to make one particular option seem maybe better than it is, or to suggest that there aren't alternatives when in fact there are. So basically, it is a misrepresentation of the situation that one finds oneself in. Some examples of this would be the U.S. electoral process. We have effectively a binary choice, and so people are trained by the electoral system. Some people consider third parties, but realistically, third parties aren't a viable option in the U.S. at the moment. So this is a system that trains us to believe that either we have a Democrat or a Republican. Those are the only two things that can happen. In reality, that's not the case. There's a lot more things that could conceptually happen. They may not be likely that those other things will happen, but there are other things that could occur. And this is, in this case, this isn't necessarily, because there are practical limitations to what else might probably occur, it's not the most egregious example. But you look at something like the gun control debate in the United States right now. It tends to be framed either as some version of no gun restrictions, or restrictions are taken, or guns are taken away entirely. It tends to be framed in terms of the two extremes, and neither of those is really the most likely option. Right? The most likely option is actually somewhere in the middle. It's just a question of where in the middle it is. Is it more towards the freedom to own guns with minimal restrictions, or is it more toward more restrictions in the interests of public safety? So but these are the kinds of things. Hot button issues tend to come down on these things. Either you're pro-choice or you're pro-life, which, if we're being honest, without getting too political about it, pro-life does not mean pro-life, it means forced birth. Sorry, but that's what it is. But these sorts of ideas, right? Again, particularly these hot button issues, these very divisive issues, are you in support of undocumented workers, or are you opposed to them? Chocolate or vanilla? These sorts of things. We often set things up in binary choices, and we ignore that there's fucking 1,000 Ben & Jerry's flavors, none of which are just chocolate and vanilla. And I mentioned Ben & Jerry's specifically because they are one of the best ice cream makers, hashtag not sponsored, but this is kind of the point, right? This is the way that we often are sort of trained to think in these binary ways by, particularly, again, in the US, by a political system that divides issues politically. Democrat and Republican don't just mean supporters of those parties, they mean particular worldviews. And so when we treat complex issues as though they are simplistic binaries, we in fact misrepresent the scope of possibilities for solving problems in the real world. And this can also, and I mean, that of course severely limits the possibilities for real world action. When this becomes a question of identity or group identity, it can also have really significant negative consequences. I think back to George W. Bush with the War on Terror. So many proclamations in his speeches that anybody who was not on the side of freedom was on the side of the terrorists. But that's a big problem for two reasons. One is that it doesn't really reflect reality. I mean, one could be opposed to the US very justifiably and be opposed to the Islamic terrorists of groups like Al-Qaeda very justifiably. There are third positions and fourth, fifth, sixth positions, things that alternatives to that binary. You don't have to support the US military invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan in order to be opposed to Al-Qaeda committing acts of international terrorism. You can actually be opposed to both. And I think it's ethically right to be opposed to both. But this also means the other element that this has, particularly this kind of false dilemma in which it is set up as an us or them situation, is that this often leads to tribalism, hatred, opposition of the people in the other group. And again, in the case of things like terrorism, immigration, racism, anti-Semitism, ableism, etc., this often leads to direct oppression and violence against people in the less powerful group, put it that way. And so these things can have real significant negative consequences in the world. I think that's worth keeping in mind when you see these kinds of arguments made, that there are only two choices about a subject. Typically, that's not true. Typically, there's more than two choices. And the question becomes finding them. What are they? And what's the actual best option?